So this week in the Sacred Gathering, we're going to do something a little different. It's going to be a kind of a revisiting of our roots, a looking at why we do what we do within the community. This is something we do every couple of years. It's something we often do kind of during New Year's when people, are thinking about good habits or resolutions. And I think with some of the things going on with us working through our getting our own 501c3 and redefining our mission as a community, it's a good time to revisit those things. So for some of you who've been around for a while, this will look familiar, but I also think we have enough people that kind of reminding why we do what we do and why we say what we say is valuable. Is this who we want to continue to be? Are these the rhythms and values that we want to continue doing as a community or not? So let me talk real briefly about just reading some quotes, some just kind of some of the basic assumptions we have around Wayfarers and maybe how they're a little different than some of the communities. Most of you will be familiar with these quotations, but I want to read just kind of a mix of quotations that are very foundational for us from both the scripture and other books we've read. So the first comes from the missiologist Michael Frost from his book Surprise the World, in which he says, Aristotle said, "We are what we repeatedly do. Excellence, then, is not an act, it is a habit." French philosopher Pierre Bourdieu referred to this as habitus. In his view, society at large develops a complex series of norms, tendencies that guide the behavior and thinking of its members. In other words, the practices and actions that a society endorses in turn shape the ways its society thinks. Habitus is the way a society helps people think, feel, and act in detrimental ways which guide them. For example, the majority of Americans would have the view that getting married, building a career, buying a house, raising a family are important and desirable milestones. These are examples of an American habitus. They are desirable practices or habits, if you will, which in turn reinforce a belief system that values monogamy, home ownership, professionalism, consumerism, and production. Of course, not every American values these things or desires these practices, but they are societal practices that in turn shape core American values. In this sense, habitus is created and reproduced unconsciously, without any deliberate pursuit of consistency. Just as society's desirable habits shape that society's values, so can an individual's personal habits shape his or her values. In fact, I think this is a much overlooked aspect of discipleship. We need to be fostering a set of habits among Christians that will in turn shape their values and beliefs. So this is one of the most fundamental kind of assumptions about Wayfarers. I think many spiritual communities approach from the idea of this is what we believe, and that will in fact shape kind of what we do and how we spend our time. And I think what Michael Frost is arguing and what Wayfarers is largely based on is in some ways the reverse assumption. Our habits will in fact form what we think, which will then form our habits, which will then form what we think, etc. It's this kind of give and take between the two. And so kind of a similar thought on why this is important comes out of 1 Peter. You were called to this kind of endurance because Christ suffered on your behalf. He left you an example so that you might follow in his footsteps. He committed no sin, nor did he ever speak in ways meant to deceive. When he was insulted, he didn't reply with insults. When he suffered, he did not threaten revenge. Instead, he entrusted himself to the one who judges justly. He carried in his own body on the cross the sins we committed. He did this so that we might live in righteousness, having nothing to do with sin. By his wounds you were healed. Although you were like straying sheep, you have now returned to the shepherd and guardian of your lives. And again, this one is just a very important quote for me, reminding us that not just is what we believe going to be lived out in habits, which will of course form who we are and what we believe, but that those habits, those rhythms, who we are trying to be formed into is to be like Christ. That is our ultimate. He is the master. We are the apprentices, is one of the common metaphors we use. It's not just a set of beliefs. It's not just a set of habits. We are hoping to be formed into people that look and think and love a lot like Christ did. Speaking of having hearts similar to Christ, I want to quote James K.A. Smith, "You are what you love." If the heart is a compass, then we need to regularly calibrate our hearts, turning them to be directed to our Creator, our magnetic north. It is crucial for us to recognize that our ultimate loves, longings, desires, and cravings are learned, and that love is a habit. Our hearts are calibrated through imitating exemplars by being immersed in practices that over time index our hearts to a certain end. We learn to love then, not primarily by acquiring information about what we should love, but rather through the practices that form habits of how we love. These sorts of practices are rituals that form and direct our affections. Now, here's the crucial insight for Christian formation and discipleship. Not only is this learned by practice the way our hearts are correctly calibrated, it is also the way our loves and longings are misdirected and miscalibrated, not because our intellect has been hijacked by bad ideas, but because our desires have been captivated by rival versions of flourishing. This means spirit-led formation of our lives is a calibration of the heart, a reorientation of our loves, that unlearning all the tacit bearings we've absorbed from cultural practices. We need to recognize how such rituals can be love-shaping practices that form and deform our desires, and then be intentional about countermeasures. So that's, again, saying many of the longings of our heart, who we become over time, is going to be shaped by what we focus on and how we spend our time in those habits. Again, these are just the basic assumptions of why Wayfarers is the way it is. Kind of a similar backup for this idea in Scripture comes out of Deuteronomy, and really could be the entire law, which I would argue is meant to kind of form our hearts and teach us to love God, right? Which is what we hear in Deuteronomy 6. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your being, and all your strength. These words that I am commanding you today must always be on your mind. Recite them to your children. Talk about them when you're sitting around your house and when you're out and about, when you're lying down and when you're getting up. Tie them on your hand as a sign. They should be a symbol on your forehead. Write them on houses' door frames and on your city gates. And again, many of these things were literally done both back in the day and nowadays. But the point, I think, is to translate and to teach our hearts to love. So this basic assumption that is what we're doing is not just an individual one. There are many people in the Christian community who've recognized that we need one another to create intentional rhythms in which we are training our hearts, in which we are training our values to love God and to love others. And this is one of the insights in which many different people have tried to build communities, and Wayfarers is one of those. So we stand in a tradition that includes monastic communities and new monastic communities and intentional communities, lots of different ways of getting at the rhythms of our life being ones which are forming us into people like God. That's what we are hoping to do at Wayfarers. And so our kind of little model is based on those assumptions, is this ugly little thing that I've heard called, the super Pokeball or something, if you're into Pokemon. And this is kind of what we are going to be looking at and dreaming about. Is this in fact what we're doing in the community? Is this who we think we actually are? And so we're gonna explain what the pieces are here. So I should get where I can actually see it. So at the very center, we say worship, which is what we'll be looking at this week. We define worship a little differently than simply what we do together. It's all of this. It's the discipleship. It's our times and our loves. It's anything we can do either communally or individually that helps focus us on God. And then the next kind of ring out, if the core is worship, are going to be service and hospitality, of taking care of others, of serving like Christ did in big needs and small needs, etc., and hospitality, inviting people into our lives and our homes. And the kind of further circle out are just specific ways that we express those kind of three inner core things, and that's through community organizing, and through neighborhood development, recognizing kind of the context of Colorado, the context of Colorado Springs in which we live, and recognizing that people aren't real good at getting together a lot of the time in this culture. And so the way that this ideally works, again, as a set of rhythms, is we gather every week to worship. We also gather for other times. We gather one-on-one. We gather in men's and women's groups, right? We work on these things together in that, and then they flow back out into hospitality. I think we value everyone having hospitality. We do this in service projects. Again, whether they're like organized for all of us or us individually, and then we do meet the culture and meet people and get to know people. And so the way this often works is usually we'll meet people in kind of one of these outer ones, and the invitation is always come in, right? We may meet you at a neighborhood event or just out in the community, but the intention is always to invite you into our lives so we can live life and share meals together. The invitation might be to serve with us or to be served by us or to have you serve us, right? Life gets richer that way. And then the invitation is always into God's presence. And so all those things will flow towards worship, and then worship, all these things will always flow back out. And so that's what our kind of community covenant is. And we've at times had this community covenant in which we try to have intentional rhythms around that. And so some people will have seen this and some people won't. And so we're just committing to, okay, if those are the things we value, if we believe it's rhythms that are going to do us, we're going to commit to being at communal worship or having personal worship if we're not. We're going to commit to looking for serving and opportunities to bless others, whether they're organized projects or gift giving, compliments, needful favors. Again, just thinking through ways in which we can serve every week. We believe in Sabbath as rest and goodness, including practices of rest, reflection, discernment, study of God. All those things are in Sabbath. And finally, being with and eating with others, eating outside of just our nuclear families, which I know there's a lot of different kind of variations on what nuclear families look like. And so, like a lot of these intentional communities, at Wayfarers, we said, this is kind of who we are. This is one of the things we think can define us, to make sure those values of worship and Sabbath and service and blessing and meals and hospitality are actually being lived out, because we live in a culture that's going to define those rhythms for us, right? In busyness, in our work play balance, etc. And this is a way of re-examining what this community is trying to do and the ways in which we are living out how we actually do this. And so we're going to take each of those pieces and spend a little more time with them. So we'll be looking at these kind of cute little trifolds. So inside, we will have the kind of the model that I was just showing you, the questions of who we do and why. But then each day, we're going to do kind of a little miniature Lectio Divina, in which we'll look at a passage of Scripture together. And then I've got a set of questions that we can take in here to go with each day, of just reflecting and praying, like, okay, how am I living this now? How might God be inviting me into it more? And then we have a little place for notes on the back, in which we can just pray and write a few notes down. And then we're going to bring these back the week afterwards and just compare notes. We're going to workshop it, say, okay, in what ways are we living into this? In what ways are we not? What's realistic right now? How are we living into what this community is? So the question is just, is Wayfarers in fact being an intentional community in which people are loving God and loving each other better each day, or not? Do we need to talk about the way we're doing this differently? Do we need different rhythms? Are we fulfilling the invitation God has for us? So yeah, feels like a lot, feels like it's all over the place, but this is kind of the discernment process of what we're going to be doing the next couple of weeks, of revisiting our roots, revisiting this kind of model we're trying to use to live faithful lives in which we are formed into the people we think God is inviting us to be.